The woman at the coffee shop counter looked me straight in the eye and said, "Why don't you mind your own business for once, Margaret?" Her voice carried that particular North Dakota edge. Polite on the surface, razor sharp underneath. What she didn't know was that I had been minding my own business for 37 years. And what she definitely didn't know was that her business was about to become very much my concern. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Coleman, and at 63, I thought I had learned to navigate the particular brand of small-town politics that comes with living in Williston, North Dakota. I had moved here in 1987, when my late husband Frank got a job with the oil company. Back then, Williston was a different place, quieter, smaller, where everyone knew everyone, and that knowledge was currency rather than weaponry. Frank passed away 4 years ago, leaving me with a modest house on Elm Street, a pension that covered my needs, and a routine that had crystallized around purpose rather than mere habit. I volunteered at the Williston Community Library every Tuesday and Thursday, organizing the children's reading programs and helping manage the annual book drive. I maintained the community garden plot that Frank and I had tended together, now growing vegetables that I distributed quietly to families I knew were stretching their grocery budgets thin. Most importantly, I served on the Williston Neighborhood Association board, a position I had held for 12 years. It wasn't glamorous work. We dealt with parking disputes, noise complaints, and the endless bureaucracy of coordinating with the city council on everything from street repairs to snow removal schedules. But it mattered. In a town where the oil boom had brought rapid changes and new tensions, the neighborhood association was one of the few places where long-term residents and newcomers could work together toward common goals. Or at least that's what I believed until the Hendersons moved in. Bradley and Cassandra Henderson arrived in Williston in late 2023, part of the latest wave of professionals drawn by the expanding energy sector. Bradley worked in project management for one of the larger drilling operations, and Cassandra had landed a position in the marketing department of a consulting firm that served the oil industry. They were in their early 40s, polished in a way that stood out against Williston's practical backdrop, and they carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way. They purchased the old Brennan house on Oak Street, a sprawling property that had sat empty for 2 years after elderly Mrs. Brennan moved to assisted living in Minot. The house needed work, but it had good bones, and sat on nearly an acre of land that backed up to the small creek that wound through our neighborhood. It should have been a straightforward integration into our community, but the Hendersons didn't seem interested in integration. They seemed interested in renovation, not just of their property, but of the entire neighborhood's social structure. It started with small things. At the September Neighborhood Association meeting, Cassandra Henderson appeared with a folder of printed materials and a presentation she had prepared without consulting anyone. She had researched property values, analyzed demographic trends, and concluded that our neighborhood was quote, 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 quote. Her solution involved implementing new community standards, architectural guidelines for exterior modifications, landscaping requirements, and a homeowner's fee structure that would fund improvements like decorative streetlights and professionally maintained common areas. The room fell silent as she spoke. These were families who had lived here for decades, many of them retirees on fixed incomes, others working-class folks who had bought their homes when Williston was still affordable. The idea of mandatory fees and design restrictions felt foreign, almost hostile. I raised my hand during the question period. "Mrs. Henderson," I said carefully, "I appreciate the research you've done, but I think we need to consider whether these changes reflect what our current residents actually want and need." She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Margaret, change is inevitable. We can either guide it thoughtfully or let it happen to us randomly. I think most people here want to see their investment protected." Bradley nodded from his seat in the back. "Property values have stagnated here compared to other neighborhoods. These improvements would benefit everyone." What followed was a tense discussion that revealed a fundamental divide. The Hendersons saw the neighborhood as an asset to be optimized. Most of the rest of us saw it as a community to be preserved. The meeting ended without any formal decisions, but the battle lines had been quietly drawn. Over the following months, the Hendersons began a systematic campaign to reshape the neighborhood according to their vision. They organized what they called planning sessions, invitation-only gatherings at their house where they presented their ideas to select neighbors. They reached out to the city council members they had connections with through Bradley's work, discussing zoning modifications and development opportunities. Most concerning to me, they began targeting specific residents who they viewed as obstacles to their plans. Mrs. Chen, whose small vegetable garden allegedly violated the aesthetic standards they wanted to implement. Tom Rodriguez, whose modest home-based auto repair business had operated quietly for 15 years without complaints, until the Hendersons decided it was incompatible with their vision of a, quote, professional residential environment. But their primary target was me. It became clear that they viewed my position on the Neighborhood Association Board as the main impediment to their agenda. At the November meeting, when I questioned the financial projections for their proposed improvements, Cassandra interrupted me mid-sentence. "Margaret, I appreciate your dedication to this community, but sometimes experience can become a barrier to progress. Maybe it's time for some fresh perspectives in leadership positions." The room temperature seemed to drop. In all my years on the board, no one had ever challenged my competence so directly, so publicly. I felt the eyes of neighbors I had worked with for over a decade, people I had helped through everything from permit applications to family emergencies. "Papa Wah." I kept my voice steady. "I think diverse perspectives are valuable, Mrs. Henderson. That's why we have open meetings and encourage input from everyone. But decision-making positions should be held by people who understand contemporary community development," Bradley added. "No offense, but this isn't 1987 anymore." The offense was clearly intended. Frank and I had arrived in 1987, had been part of Williston's growth and changes for decades. They were reducing our contribution to irrelevance, dismissing our knowledge as outdated baggage. After the meeting, as I was gathering my papers, Cassandra approached me with that same non-smile. "Margaret, I hope you don't take any of this personally. It's just business." But it wasn't just business. It was personal from the moment they decided that my voice, my history, my relationships in this community were obstacles to be managed, rather than resources to be valued. December brought the first real confrontation. The Hendersons had submitted a proposal to the city council to rezone a section of our neighborhood for mixed-use development. They had done this without informing the neighborhood association, without community input, without even basic courtesy. I only learned about it when I received a notice in the mail about a public hearing scheduled for the following week. I spent the weekend calling neighbors, organizing attendance at the hearing, and preparing materials that outlined why this rezoning would be detrimental to our community's character and the property values the Hendersons claim to care so much about. At the hearing, I spoke for 8 minutes about the neighborhood's history, the careful balance of residential and community spaces that had been maintained for decades, and the concerns of residents who had not been consulted about this significant change. When I finished, there was substantial applause from the neighbors who had shown up. Then Bradley Henderson took the podium. Instead of addressing the substance of my concerns, he focused on what he called, quote, resistance to necessary progress by certain individuals who have become overly attached to the status quo. After the hearing, as neighbors were filing out, Cassandra cornered me near the exit. Her voice was low, meant only for me. "Margaret, you're making this harder than it needs to be. You might want to consider whether it's worth creating all this conflict over changes that are going to happen anyway." I met her gaze directly. "Mrs. Henderson, this is my community. These are my neighbors. I'm not going to stand by while decisions that affect all of us are made without our input." She stepped closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Maybe it's time you learn to mind your own business." That phrase, "mind your own business," would echo in my head for days, because what she didn't understand was that this neighborhood, these people, this community that Frank and I had helped build and sustain for 37 years, this was my business. And I was about to start minding it very, very carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weeks following that city council hearing revealed the true scope of what I was dealing with. The Hendersons weren't just pushy newcomers with grand ideas. They were systematic, strategic, and they had resources I was only beginning to understand. It started with the coffee shop incident. Grounded coffee on Main Street had been my Tuesday morning ritual for 3 years. I would arrive at 8:30, order a medium dark roast, and spend an hour reading the Williston Herald, while the morning rush settled into the quieter rhythm of mid-morning regulars. It was my small piece of predictable peace in a week that had become increasingly turbulent. That Tuesday in January, I walked into Grounded to find Cassandra Henderson already there, seated at a corner table with 2 women I recognized but didn't know well, newer residents who had moved to Williston within the past couple of years. Their conversation was animated, punctuated by occasional glances toward the door. When I entered, the talking stopped. I approached the counter where Jenny Morrison, the owner's daughter, was working the register. Jenny had grown up in Williston, had known my family since she was in elementary school, but that morning, her usual friendly greeting was replaced by something cooler, more formal. "What can I get you, Mrs. Coleman?" "The usual, please. Medium dark roast." As Jenny prepared my coffee, I heard Cassandra's voice rise slightly from the corner table. "Exactly what we're talking about. Some people think they own this town just because they've been here forever. But longevity isn't the same as leadership." I paid for my coffee and found my usual seat near the window. But within minutes, Cassandra was standing beside my table. "Margaret, how convenient to run into you here." I was just discussing the upcoming neighborhood association elections with some concerned residents. Elections. The word hit me like cold water. Our neighborhood association had never held formal elections. Board positions had always been filled by volunteers, usually rotating naturally as people's availability and interest changed. In my 12 years, I had simply continued serving because no one else had expressed interest in taking on the administrative work. "I wasn't aware we were planning elections," I said carefully. "Oh, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Cassandra's voice carried just loud enough for the other patrons to hear. "Decisions being made without proper democratic input. Don't you think the community deserves a voice in who represents them?" Before I could respond, she continued. "Bradley and I have been researching best practices for community governance. Most successful neighborhoods have clear electoral processes, term limits, and accountability measures. We think it's time Williston caught up with modern standards." The 2 women from her table had moved closer, hovering at the edges of our conversation. One of them, a blonde woman in her 30s wearing expensive athletic wear, nodded enthusiastically. "It only makes sense that people should have choices. Competition improves everything." I set down my coffee cup. "Mrs. Henderson, if there are residents who want to serve on the board, I'm always happy to welcome new voices. We have committee positions available, and—" "That's exactly what we mean," Cassandra interrupted. "This attitude that you get to decide who's welcome and how they can participate. The community should choose its representatives, not inherit them." The blonde woman stepped forward. "I'm Tiffany Barnes, by the way. My husband and I moved here from Denver last year. Back there, our HOA had real structure, real standards. It's shocking how informal things are here." The third woman, dark-haired and wearing what looked like designer jeans, introduced herself as Monica Wells. "We're not trying to cause trouble," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We just want to make sure everyone has equal say in how our neighborhood develops." I recognized the language they were using, the same corporate buzzwords that had filled Cassandra's presentation at the September meeting. Equal say, and democratic input, and community voice. But what they were really describing was a hostile takeover, a systematic replacement of informal community cooperation with formal power structures they could control. "Well," I said, standing to leave, "I suppose we'll need to discuss this at the next association meeting." Cassandra smiled that sharp smile. "Actually, we've already spoken with several board members about scheduling a special meeting to address governance issues. Democratic participation can't wait for bureaucratic convenience." As I walked toward the door, I heard her voice one more time, pitched to Carrie. "Margaret, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to learn to mind your own business for once." The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how completely she misunderstood what was happening. This wasn't about my ego or my attachment to a volunteer position. This was about the systematic dismantling of a community that had taken decades to build. I drove home through streets I had traveled thousands of times, but everything felt different. The modest houses, the unmatched mailboxes, the yards that reflected their owners' personalities rather than a design committee's vision. All of it suddenly seemed fragile, threatened. At home, I made a pot of tea and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad. If the Hendersons wanted to play politics, I needed to understand the game. I started making lists: board members, their contact information, their likely positions on various issues, neighbors who had attended recent meetings, community leaders who might have influence. But as I worked, I realized how much I didn't know about the changing dynamics in our neighborhood. How many of the newer residents shared the Hendersons' vision? How many of the long-term residents were growing tired of conflict and might be willing to go along with changes just to restore peace? The phone rang as I was wrestling with these questions. It was Dorothy Flanagan, who had served on the association board for 8 years before stepping down last spring to care for her aging mother. "Margaret, I just heard about what happened at Grounded. Jenny Morrison's mother called me. Apparently half the coffee shop heard that woman tell you to mind your own business." "News travels fast," I said. "Faster when it's that kind of news." "Margaret, what exactly are these people up to?" I told Dorothy about the elections proposal, the governance research, the systematic recruitment of newer residents. As I spoke, I could hear her frustration building. 12 years you've served on that board," she said. 12 years of unpaid work, dealing with every petty complaint and paperwork headache in the neighborhood. And now they want to treat you like some kind of political obstacle? "It's not about me personally, Dorothy. It's about the kind of community we want to be." "No, Margaret, it is personal. They're making it personal by targeting you specifically. And if you don't start treating it that way, they're gonna roll right over you." After Dorothy hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of the January afternoon, thinking about her words. I had spent my adult life believing that good intentions and honest work would speak for themselves. But the Hendersons were operating by different rules, and they were counting on my reluctance to engage in open conflict. The special meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Cassandra had somehow managed to get it added to the community center's calendar and had arranged for notices to be posted on the neighborhood message board and sent through the informal email list we used for association communications. When I arrived that Thursday evening, the community center's main room was more crowded than I had ever seen it for an association meeting. The usual suspects were there: Dorothy and her husband Jim, the Rodriguez family, Mrs. Chen, the handful of longtime residents who regularly attended. But there were also dozens of faces I barely recognized, newer residents who had never shown interest in association business before. The Hendersons had positioned themselves strategically. Bradley sat in the front row with a laptop and what appeared to be prepared remarks. Cassandra had claimed a seat at the board table, despite not being an official member. Their allies, Tiffany Barnes, Monica Wells, and several others, were scattered throughout the room. I took my usual spot at the board table and called the meeting to order. But before I could go through the standard agenda, Cassandra stood up. "Point of order," she said. "Before we proceed with routine business, I think we need to address the fundamental question of whether this board has the authority to continue making decisions without a clear mandate from the community." And just like that, the battle was joined. Not over specific policies or neighborhood improvements, but over who had the right to speak for our community and how that authority should be determined. The next 2 hours would prove to be just the opening skirmish in a war. One was still learning how to fight. The special meeting became a masterclass in political theater, though I didn't recognize it as such until it was nearly over. What I had expected to be a discussion about community governance turned into something closer to a tribunal, with me as the unwitting defendant. Cassandra Henderson had done her homework. She stood at the front of the room with a presentation folder and the confidence of someone who had already won the argument before it began. Her opening statement was polished, reasonable, and devastating. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "we're here tonight because our community has reached a crossroads. We can continue with informal, unaccountable leadership that makes decisions behind closed doors. Or we can embrace transparent, democratic governance that gives every resident an equal voice." She had framed the entire issue as democracy versus autocracy, with me cast as the obstacle to progress. It was brilliant in its simplicity and completely dishonest in its premise. Over the past 6 months, Cassandra continued, we've seen critical decisions made without community input. Property tax assessments have been challenged without resident notification. Development proposals have been supported or opposed based on the preferences of a few individuals rather than the will of the community. I felt my chest tighten. The property tax challenges she referenced had been legitimate disputes over assessments that were clearly inflated. I had helped 3 families file appeals and had succeeded in getting their taxes reduced by an average of 12%. The development proposals were Bradley's own rezoning scheme, which I had opposed precisely because it lacked community support. But to the newer residents in the room, Cassandra's words painted a picture of secretive, self-serving leadership. I could see nods of agreement, murmurs of concern. Bradley took over seamlessly. We're not here to attack anyone personally, he said, though that was exactly what they were doing. Margaret Coleman has served this community for many years, and we respect that service. But times change, and governance structures need to evolve. He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that compared our neighborhood association to what he called best practices from other communities. Formal elections, term limits, committee structures, financial oversight procedures. It all sounded professional and modern. The question, Bradley concluded, is whether we're ready to move forward together, or whether we're going to remain stuck in outdated approaches that limit our potential. When they finished their presentation, the room was silent for a moment. Then Tiffany Barnes raised her hand. I'd like to nominate Cassandra Henderson for president of the Neighborhood Association. Monica Wells seconded immediately. I think it's time for fresh leadership. I realized then how thoroughly I had been outmaneuvered. They hadn't called this meeting to discuss governance improvements. They had called it to stage a coup. Hold on, said Jim Flanagan from the back of the room. We can't just hold elections without following proper procedures. Don't we need advance notice, candidate registration, some kind of process? Cassandra smiled. Actually, Jim, we've researched the legal requirements. Volunteer organizations like neighborhood associations can modify their governance structures by majority vote. We're not bound by complex electoral laws. She was technically correct, which made her position even more infuriating. Our informal structure, which had worked well for decades, left us vulnerable to this kind of hostile takeover. I'd like to hear from Margaret, said Mrs. Chen. She's been dealing with the city and the county on our behalf for years. I think she deserves a chance to respond. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of history in that room. Not just my 12 years on the board, but the decades of careful relationship building that had made our neighborhood function. I could also feel how fragile all of it suddenly was. Thank you, Mrs. Chen, I began. I want to address something that troubles me about tonight's presentation. The Hendersons have described our current approach as undemocratic and secretive. But every decision I've made as a board member has been discussed at open meetings. Every neighbor has always been welcome to participate. I looked around the room, making eye contact with people I had worked with for years. When the Patel family needed help understanding the permit process for their deck addition, we spent 3 meetings walking through the requirements. When the city proposed changes to snow removal routes, we organized a petition drive that got the decision reversed. When the Hendersons themselves had questions about the creek easement behind their property, I spent 2 hours researching the regulations and connecting them with the right county officials. I could see some of the newer residents shifting uncomfortably. They hadn't been aware of these examples of community advocacy. The question isn't whether we need accountability, I continued. The question is whether we want to replace a system based on cooperation and mutual assistance with one based on political competition and formal power structures. Bradley stood up. But Margaret, cooperation requires trust, and trust requires transparency. How can we be sure that decisions are being made in everyone's best interest when there's no formal oversight? Before I could respond, Dorothy Flanagan spoke from the audience. Bradley, I was on that board for 8 years. I've watched Margaret handle everything from noise complaints to property disputes to budget issues. I've never seen her make a decision that wasn't in the community's best interest, even when it would have been easier to avoid getting involved. With respect, Dorothy, Cassandra interjected, personal testimonials aren't the same as institutional accountability. Good intentions aren't enough when we're talking about governance. Tom Rodriguez raised his hand. I've got a question for the Hendersons. You've been here, 6 months? How exactly do you know what's best for a community you just joined? The room grew tense. It was the first direct challenge to the Hendersons' authority to lead this process. That's exactly the kind of thinking that holds communities back, Tiffany Barnes said. Fresh perspectives aren't a liability, they're an asset. Sometimes you need outsiders to see problems that insiders have become blind to. What problems? Mrs. Chen asked sharply. What exactly is wrong with our neighborhood that needs fixing? Monica Wells answered. Property values have stagnated. Infrastructure is outdated. There's no coordinated approach to community development. We're falling behind other neighborhoods in terms of amenities and planning. My property value has gone up 18% in the past 3 years, said Jim Flanagan, and our infrastructure works fine. What exactly are you proposing to improve? This was the moment when the Hendersons' agenda became fully visible. Cassandra opened a different folder and began describing their vision: architectural review committees, landscape requirements, community fee structures, development partnerships with local businesses. We're talking about transforming this neighborhood into a model community, Bradley said. Professional landscaping, coordinated exterior design, enhanced property values through strategic improvements. And mandatory fees to pay for all this? Asked Dorothy. Investment in community infrastructure, Cassandra corrected. Residents who benefit from improvements should contribute to their cost. I felt something click into place. This wasn't about democracy or accountability. This was about money, specifically about implementing the expensive improvement plan they had pitched months earlier, despite the clear lack of community support. How much are we talking about? I asked. Bradley consulted his notes. Initial estimates suggest annual fees of $300 to $500 per household, with some larger assessments for major improvements. The room erupted. For many of the families present, especially the retirees on fixed incomes, $300 was a significant expense. The Hendersons had just revealed that their vision of democratic governance involved forcing their neighbors to pay for improvements they hadn't asked for and couldn't afford. But as the angry voices filled the room, I noticed something else. The newer residents who had been nodding along with the Hendersons' presentation were suddenly quiet. They were beginning to understand that they had been recruited to support an agenda they hadn't fully understood. I think, I said loudly enough to cut through the noise, we need to table this discussion until people have time to review these proposals and their financial implications. I second that motion, called out Tom Rodriguez. Cassandra looked frustrated. We can't make progress if we keep delaying difficult decisions. We can't make good decisions if we're being pressured to vote on proposals we're hearing for the first time, I replied. The meeting ended without resolution, but the battle lines were now completely clear. The Hendersons had overplayed their hand by revealing the financial burden their plans would impose, but they had also demonstrated their willingness to manipulate democratic processes to achieve their goals. As people filed out, I found myself surrounded by longtime neighbors offering support and expressing anger at what they had witnessed. But I also noticed that several of the newer residents left without speaking to anyone, looking uncertain and uncomfortable. The Hendersons had made their first major tactical error, but I was beginning to realize that if I wanted to protect our community, I was going to have to stop playing defense and start playing offense. And that meant it was time to do some research of my own. The morning after the special meeting, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to my volunteer shift at the library. Not because I was physically ill, but because I needed time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to investigate exactly who I was dealing with. I started with the basics. The Hendersons had moved to Williston in late 2023, but from where? Bradley worked for Apex Energy Solutions, but what was his background? Cassandra's marketing consulting firm. What kind of clients did they serve? These weren't idle questions anymore. Their presentation the night before had been too polished, too coordinated to be the work of concerned newcomers. This felt professional. My first stop was the Williams County Recorder's Office. Public records don't lie, and property transactions leave paper trails. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, whom I didn't recognize, was helpful but cautious. "I need to look up the deed transfer for 247 Oak Street," I told her. "The Brennan property that sold last year." 20 minutes later, I was staring at documents that raised more questions than they answered. The Hendersons hadn't bought the house directly from Mrs. Brennan's estate. Instead, it had been purchased by something called Northern Plains Development LLC in March 2023, then transferred to the Hendersons in October for significantly less than the original purchase price. "Can you look up information about this LLC?" I asked Sarah. She typed for a few moments, then shook her head. "It's registered in Delaware. We'd only have local filing information here." Delaware. I'd read enough business news to know that Delaware was where companies went to hide their ownership structures. Why would a limited liability company buy a single-family home in Williston, North Dakota, only to sell it months later at a loss to the Hendersons? My next stop was the public library, where I spent 3 hours on the computers researching everything I could find about Bradley and Cassandra Henderson. What I discovered was unsettling. Bradley Henderson had indeed worked for several energy companies, but his track record was curious. He'd spent 2 years with Titan Energy in Texas, leaving just before the company faced federal investigations for environmental violations. Before that, he'd worked for Mountain West Resources in Colorado, departing 6 months before they were hit with a massive lawsuit over water rights disputes. Cassandra's background was even more interesting. Her LinkedIn profile listed her as a helpees and consultant, specializing in strategic neighborhood transformation and residential property optimization. Her client list included several real estate development firms and what appeared to be property flipping operations. But it was a newspaper article from Fort Collins, Colorado, that made everything click into place. The headline read, "Residents Fight Back Against Neighborhood Improvement Scheme." The article described a situation remarkably similar to what was happening in Williston. Newcomers pushing for expensive community improvements, mandatory fees, and governance changes that would force out longtime residents and open the door for redevelopment. The article mentioned several of the key players by name, including Bradley and Cassandra Henderson. I printed the article and sat in the library parking lot reading it twice. According to the report, the Hendersons had moved into an established neighborhood in Fort Collins, organized a campaign for modernization, and within 18 months had successfully pushed through changes that resulted in property tax increases, special assessments, and ultimately forced sales by residents who couldn't afford the new costs. The neighborhood had been improved all right, straight into the hands of a development company that built expensive townhomes where modest single-family houses had once stood. My hands were shaking as I drove home. This wasn't about community improvement or democratic governance. This was a business model. The Hendersons were professional neighborhood gentrifiers, and Williston was their latest target. But I needed more proof, and I needed to understand who was backing them. That evening, I called my nephew David in Minneapolis. David worked in commercial real estate and understood the financial mechanisms that I was only beginning to grasp. "Aunt Margaret, what you're describing sounds like a land banking operation," he said after I explained what I'd discovered. Someone identifies undervalued neighborhoods, creates conditions that force property turnover, then develops or flips the land for profit. But how does that work exactly? Usually through a combination of manufactured crises and manufactured solutions. You create problems, like governance disputes or infrastructure emergencies, then offer expensive fixes that some residents can't afford. When they sell, your investment group buys their properties below market value. What about this Delaware LLC? David was quiet for a moment. That's probably the investment vehicle. Delaware Incorporation makes it almost impossible to trace the actual ownership. But Aunt Margaret, if this is what you think it is, you're not just dealing with your neighbors anymore. You're dealing with people who have serious money behind them. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents I'd gathered spread out in front of me. Property records, newspaper articles, business registrations. The pattern was clear, but the scale was bigger than I'd imagined. I thought about Mrs. Chen, struggling to maintain her modest home on a fixed income. About Tom Rodriguez, whose small auto repair business provided essential services to working families. About all the neighbors who had built lives in our community because it was affordable, stable, and welcoming. The Hendersons weren't just trying to change our neighborhood, they were trying to eliminate us. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to dig deeper into Northern Plains Development LLC. The clerk in the business licensing office was more helpful than I'd expected. Northern Plains has filed applications for several properties in the area, she told me. Let me print you a list. The list contained 12 addresses, all in our neighborhood or the adjacent areas. Properties that had been quietly purchased over the past 8 months, many through estate sales or financial distress situations. Do you know who owns the LLC? I asked. She shook her head. Delaware Corporation. But I can tell you they've been very active. Cash purchases, quick closings, minimal inspection periods. Someone with deep pockets and a clear strategy. I thanked her and walked out to the parking lot, my mind racing. 12 properties. The Hendersons weren't just targeting our neighborhood association. They were systematically acquiring real estate throughout the area. But there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The timing of everything felt too convenient. The Hendersons' arrival just before Mrs. Brennan moved to assisted living. Their immediate focus on neighborhood association politics. The sudden appearance of other newcomers who supported their agenda. That afternoon, I decided to visit Mrs. Brennan at the Sunset Manor Assisted Living Facility in Minot. The drive took an hour, and I wasn't even sure she would agree to see me. We'd been neighbors for decades but had never been close friends. Mrs. Brennan was smaller and frailer than I remembered, but her mind was sharp. When I explained why I'd come, her expression grew troubled. I've been wondering about that sale, she admitted. My daughter handled all the arrangements, but something didn't feel right about the whole process. What do you mean? Well, I'd planned to sell to the Johnsons. You know, the young couple with the 2 little boys. They'd been renting the apartment above Tom Rodriguez's garage, saving up for a down payment. We'd shaken hands on a price that was fair for both of us. I remembered the Johnsons. A hard-working couple, both employed at the hospital. They would have been perfect neighbors. But then this company came along and offered $15,000 more, all cash, close in 2 weeks. My daughter said I'd be crazy not to take it. But Margaret, I didn't need that extra money. I would have rather seen the house go to a young family. Did your daughter tell you who pressured her to take the higher offer? Mrs. Brennan's expression grew troubled. She said a very nice woman had called her, someone who specialized in helping families navigate estate sales. Said she was looking out for our best interests, making sure I got full market value for the property. Do you remember the woman's name? Something with a C, Christina? No. Cassandra. That was it. Cassandra Henderson. I drove back to Williston in a daze. The Hendersons hadn't just moved to our neighborhood and decided to improve it. They had orchestrated their own arrival, manipulating Mrs. Brennan's daughter into accepting an offer that displaced a young family and put the property in the hands of their investment group. This wasn't opportunistic gentrification. This was predatory development with our community as the prey. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. The Hendersons had told me to mind my own business. Well, it was time to start minding their business very, very carefully. And I was going to make sure the entire neighborhood understood exactly what they were dealing with. Namatolis tak meshid, taimayalis galoa bismao. The war was about to begin in earnest. Armed with the knowledge of what I was really fighting, I realized I needed allies who understood the stakes. But more than that, I needed evidence that would stand up to scrutiny and a strategy that would expose the Hendersons' operation before they could complete it. My first call was to Janet Kowalski, the investigative reporter for the Williston Herald. Janet had covered the oil boom's impact on local communities for years, and she had a reputation for digging deep into stories that others overlooked. Janet, I think I have a story for you, I said when she answered. But it's complicated, and I'm going to need your help to get to the bottom of it. We met that afternoon at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from the places where the Hendersons and their allies might overhear. I spread out everything I'd gathered: the property records, the newspaper article from Colorado, the list of LLC purchases, Mrs. Brennan's account of the manipulated sale. Janet studied the documents with the focused attention of someone who knew how to read between the lines. After 20 minutes, she looked up with the expression of a hunter who'd caught a scent. Margaret, if what you're suggesting is true, this goes way beyond neighborhood politics. This is systematic community displacement for profit. But I need more than circumstantial evidence to run a story. What kind of evidence? Financial records would be ideal, but those are probably locked up tight. What I can do is start pulling property records for all these addresses, tracking the ownership chains, looking for patterns. I can also reach out to my contacts in Colorado to verify what happened there. She paused, tapping her pen against her notepad. But Margaret, you need to understand something. If these people are as professional as you think they are, they're going to fight back hard when they realize someone's investigating them. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Mrs. Chen's worried face at the special meeting, about the Johnson family who'd been cheated out of their dream home, about all the neighbors who had no idea they were being targeted by predators. I'm prepared, I said. Janet smiled grimly. Good. Because we're going to need to be smarter than they are. Over the next week, Janet and I worked together like a detective team. She handled the official investigations, filing public records requests, interviewing sources, tracking down leads. I handled the community intelligence, talking to neighbors, observing patterns, gathering the kind of information that only comes from living in a place for decades. What we discovered was both more extensive and more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. Northern Plains Development, LLC had purchased properties not just in our immediate neighborhood, but throughout a carefully defined geographic area that corresponded almost exactly with the city's planned infrastructure improvements for the next 5 years. Someone with inside knowledge of municipal planning had identified which areas would see increased property values and had positioned themselves to capitalize on that growth. But the really damning evidence came from Janet's contacts in Colorado. The Fort Collins situation hadn't been an isolated incident. Janet found similar patterns in 3 other communities where the Hendersons had operated: a neighborhood in Denver, a small town outside Boulder, and a rural community that had been targeted for resort development. In each case, the pattern was identical: move into an established community, create governance crises, push through expensive improvements that forced out longtime residents, then facilitate development or resale that benefited their investment group. They're like locusts, Janet said as we reviewed her findings. They move in, strip the community of its character and affordability, then move on to the next target. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Rodriguez called me on Thursday evening, his voice tight with anger. Margaret, you need to know something. My cousin Luis works for the city planning department. He just told me something that's going to make you furious. I met Tom at his garage, where he did auto repair work in the evenings and weekends. He was working on a transmission, his hands black with grease, but his attention was entirely focused on what he had to tell me. Luis says the city's been getting pressure from some development group about fast-tracking zoning changes for our area. They want to reclassify residential properties to allow mixed-use development. Luis didn't think much of it until I told him about what's been happening with the neighborhood association. What kind of pressure? The kind that comes with campaign contributions and promises of increased tax revenue. Someone's been working the city council members, telling them that our neighborhood is quote, underutilized and could support higher density development. Tom wiped his hands on a rag, his expression grim. Margaret, they're not just trying to take over our neighborhood association. They're trying to change the zoning so they can tear down our houses and build apartments or condos. This was the missing piece. The expensive improvements the Hendersons were pushing weren't meant to enhance our neighborhood. They were meant to make it financially impossible for current residents to stay, clearing the way for redevelopment. Does Luis know who's behind the pressure? He's not supposed to talk about it, but he's worried about what it would mean for families like mine. He said the paperwork came from a law firm in Bismarck, but the real money seems to be coming from some out-of-state investment group. That weekend, I called an emergency meeting with my closest allies, Dorothy and Jim Flanagan, Tom Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen, and 3 other longtime residents who understood what we were facing. We met at Dorothy's house, away from public spaces where we might be overheard. I laid out everything we'd discovered: the property acquisitions, the professional gentrification operation, the zoning pressure, the connection to the Delaware LLC. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. "So what do we do?" asked Mrs. Chen. "How do we fight people with that kind of money and influence?" It was Jim Flanagan who provided the answer. "We use their own strategy against them. They're counting on us being divided, confused, and reactive. But we know this community better than they do. We know who lives here, what they care about, what they can't afford to lose." Dorothy nodded. "And we know something else they don't expect. We know what they're really up to." I looked around the room at these people who had become more than neighbors over the years. They had become family. The kind of family that forms when people choose to care for each other in their shared home. "There's something else," I said. "Janet's going to run the story, but she needs one more week to verify some details. That gives us time to organize before the Hendersons know we're onto them." "What kind of organizing?" Tom asked. I had been thinking about this question for days. The Hendersons had used information, influence, and intimidation to advance their agenda. But there was one thing they couldn't control or manipulate: the genuine relationships that held our community together. "We're going to tell the truth," I said, "to every neighbor, every family, every person who lives in the target area. We're going to make sure they understand exactly what's happening and what it means for their future." "A door-to-door campaign?" Dorothy asked. "More than that. We're going to document everything: who owns what properties, which families are being pressured to sell, how the zoning changes would affect each household. We're going to make this so public, so transparent, that the Hendersons won't be able to operate in the shadows anymore." Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time in weeks. "They told you to mind your own business. Now you're going to mind everyone's business." "Exactly," I said. "And we're going to do it so thoroughly that they'll wish they'd never heard of Williston, North Dakota." Over the next 3 days, we organized the most comprehensive community information campaign our neighborhood had ever seen. We divided up the target area, prepared fact sheets with documentation, and began the patient work of education that would ultimately determine whether our community survived or became another casualty of predatory development. The Hendersons had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that when you threaten a community that knows how to work together, you don't just face individual resistance. You face the collective power of people who refuse to be displaced from their own home. The door-to-door campaign began on a Tuesday morning in February, with temperatures hovering around 15 below zero. Most people would have waited for warmer weather, but we couldn't afford to wait. Every day gave the Hendersons more time to pressure additional families into selling or to advance their zoning manipulation through City Hall. Dorothy Flanagan and I took the north side of our target area, bundled in winter coats and carrying folders full of documentation. Our first stop was the Patel family, who lived 3 blocks from the Hendersons in a modest ranch house they'd purchased 5 years earlier. Raj Patel answered the door in his scrubs. He worked the night shift at the hospital and had just gotten home. When I explained why we were there, his expression shifted from polite confusion to alarmed attention. "You're saying someone is trying to force us to sell our house?" he asked, inviting us into the warm kitchen where his wife Priya was making breakfast for their 2 young children. I spread out the property maps on their kitchen table, showing them the pattern of LLC purchases surrounding their neighborhood. Not force, exactly, but create conditions that make it very difficult for families like yours to stay. Dorothy explained the special assessment strategy. If they succeed in implementing their, quote, improvement plan, you'd be looking at annual fees of $300 to $500, plus special assessments for major projects. Last year alone, they're proposing improvements that would cost each household an additional $1,200. Priya set down her coffee cup, her face pale. "We don't have that kind of money. We're still paying off Raj's student loans." "That's exactly the point," I said gently. "They're counting on families like yours not being able to afford the increases. When you sell, their investment group will be ready to buy your property below market value." Raj studied the documents, his medical training making him naturally analytical. "This Northern Plains development? They already own the house 2 blocks from here? The one where the elderly woman moved out last fall?" "Mrs. Peterson's place," Dorothy confirmed. "Her grandson told me they got a call offering cash, quick closing, no inspections. She needed to move closer to her daughter in Fargo, and the offer seemed too good to refuse. But she sold for $30,000 less than the Hartmans got for their house last spring, I added. Same size property, same condition. The difference was that Mrs. Peterson was under pressure and didn't have time to get competing offers. We spent an hour with the Patels, walking through every aspect of what we'd discovered. By the time we left, they understood they weren't facing a neighborhood improvement initiative. They were facing a systematic displacement campaign. What can we do? Priya asked as we prepared to leave. Come to the community meeting Thursday night, Dorothy said, and talk to your neighbors. The more people who understand what's happening, the harder it becomes for the Hendersons to operate. Our next stop was less successful. The Brennans, no relation to Mrs. Brennan who had sold to the LLC, were a retired couple who had moved to Williston 3 years earlier from Minneapolis. When I explained our concerns about the Hendersons' agenda, Mr. Brennan was dismissive. Honestly, Margaret, some of their ideas sound pretty good to me. Our neighborhood in Minneapolis had strict design standards, and it really maintained property values. His wife nodded. We've been thinking about selling in a few years anyway. If these improvements increase our equity, why would we oppose them? It was a reminder that not everyone in our community shared the same priorities. For families like the Patels, our neighborhood represented stability and affordability. For couples like the Brennans, it was an investment that they hoped to cash out eventually. But we found more allies than opponents. The Johnsons, the young family who had been displaced from Mrs. Brennan's house purchase, were living in a cramped apartment and desperately searching for affordable housing. When we explained how the LLC had manipulated that sale, Sarah Johnson started crying. We had everything arranged, she said. The down payment, the mortgage approval, even measurements for furniture. Then suddenly the house was sold to someone else for cash. Her husband Mike was angrier. That woman told Mrs. Brennan's daughter she was looking out for the family's interests. But she was really making sure we couldn't buy the house. By Thursday evening, word had spread through the community faster than we had anticipated. The meeting we'd planned for 30 people drew over 60, filling the community center's main room beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, sat on folding chairs borrowed from the church next door, and spilled into the hallway. I had prepared remarks, but the energy in the room made formal presentations unnecessary. People wanted to talk, to share what they'd learned, to express their anger and fear about what was happening to their community. Tom Rodriguez spoke first. My family has lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. We chose this place because it was affordable, because the neighbors looked out for each other, because our kids could grow up in a safe, stable environment. Now we're supposed to pay extra fees so our neighborhood can look like some suburban development in Denver? Mrs. Chen stood up. I'm 78 years old. I live on Social Security and a small pension. If they implement these fees and assessments, I'll have to choose between my medication and my mortgage. But it was Janet Kowalski's presentation that transformed the meeting from a community complaint session into something more strategic. She had brought copies of her preliminary investigation, including property ownership charts, financial projections, and comparisons with the Colorado operations. What you're facing isn't unique, she told the crowd. This same pattern has been implemented in at least 4 other communities. The average result is a 40% turnover in residents within 3 years, with property values initially rising, then stagnating as the community character is destroyed. She clicked through a slideshow showing before and after photos from Fort Collins. This is what improvement looks like when it's driven by profit rather than community needs. The photos were devastating. A neighborhood that had once looked much like ours. Modest homes, varied architectural styles, children's toys in yards, had been transformed into a sterile collection of identical townhomes with tiny lawns and no character. The question, Janet concluded, is whether you're going to let this happen here. That's when Cassandra Henderson walked in. She entered quietly, accompanied by Bradley and 2 people I didn't recognize, a man in an expensive suit and a woman with a legal pad. They found seats in the back, but their presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room. I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of pretending they weren't there or asking them to leave, I acknowledged them directly. Mrs. Henderson, since you're here, perhaps you'd like to respond to some of the concerns that have been raised tonight. The room fell silent. Cassandra stood slowly, her expression carefully neutral. Margaret, I think there's been some misunderstanding about our intentions. We're simply trying to bring professional community development practices to a neighborhood that has tremendous potential. Is it true that you've operated similar development programs in Colorado? Asked Janet. We've been involved in community improvement initiatives in several locations, Bradley answered. That experience is exactly why we're qualified to help here. What happened to the families who couldn't afford the improvements in those other communities? Tom Rodriguez called out. Cassandra's composure cracked slightly. Community development always involves some transition. People make choices based on their priorities and circumstances. Choices? Sarah Johnson stood up, her voice carrying across the room. What choice did we have when you manipulated the sale of Mrs. Brennan's house to keep us from buying it? The man in the expensive suit whispered something to Cassandra. She nodded and addressed the room again. I think this meeting has become unnecessarily adversarial. We came here hoping to have a constructive dialogue about community improvement. Instead, we're facing accusations and conspiracy theories. Are you denying that Northern Plains Development LLC has purchased 12 properties in this area? I asked. The suit leaned forward. I'm Robert Carlisle, legal counsel for several development entities. I want to make it clear that all property transactions have been conducted legally and ethically. Any accusations to the contrary could constitute defamation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. But instead of intimidating the crowd, it seemed to energize them. People who had been sitting quietly began murmuring angrily. The atmosphere shifted from concerned to defiant. Dorothy Flanagan stood up. Are you threatening people for asking questions about what's happening in their own neighborhood? We're simply protecting our clients' rights, Carlisle replied. That's when I realized the Hendersons had made their second major tactical error. By bringing a lawyer to threaten a room full of worried neighbors, they had revealed the true nature of their operation. This wasn't about community improvement. It was about business interests protected by legal intimidation. The meeting ended shortly after, but not before we had accomplished something crucial. Every person in that room now understood exactly what they were fighting and why it mattered. As people filed out, they weren't just angry. They were organized. And the Hendersons had just discovered that their professional operation was about to face something they hadn't encountered before, a community that refused to be intimidated. The morning after the community meeting, I woke up to find my phone buzzing with messages. Word had spread beyond our neighborhood. Janet's preliminary story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and reporters from Bismarck and Grand Forks were calling for interviews. But it was the call from my nephew, David, in Minneapolis that gave me the idea that would change everything. Aunt Margaret, I've been thinking about what you told me, he said. About this Delaware LLC and the property acquisitions. I have a contact at the State Attorney General's office who specializes in real estate fraud. If what you're describing is true, there might be grounds for an investigation. What kind of investigation? Conspiracy to manipulate property values, fraudulent business practices, potentially even racketeering if they can prove a pattern across multiple states. But they'd need solid documentation. I thought about all the evidence Janet and I had gathered, the property records, the pattern of manipulation in other communities. How solid? Documented communications would be ideal. Financial records, evidence of coordination between the LLC and the Hendersons. Proof that they're using deceptive practices to acquire properties. After David hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the morning light filtering through frost-covered windows. The Hendersons had been operating under the assumption that they were dealing with naive small-town residents who wouldn't understand their sophisticated business model. But they had underestimated something crucial, the power of community networks. My first call was to Mrs. Peterson's grandson in Fargo. He had mentioned during our earlier conversation that his grandmother had kept all the paperwork from her house sale, including recordings of phone calls she'd made about the transaction. She was always worried about being taken advantage of, he explained when I reached him. So she started recording important calls after she had some trouble with a contractor a few years ago. Everything's legal. North Dakota is a one-party consent state. 20 minutes later, I was listening to audio recordings that would have made any prosecutor smile. Cassandra Henderson's voice was clear and unmistakable as she explained to Mrs. Peterson's daughter why the family needed to accept the LLC's offer immediately. Property values in that area are about to decline significantly, Cassandra had said. We're offering above market rate now, but that window is closing fast. If you wait, your mother could lose thousands of dollars. It was a lie, and we could prove it. Property values in our neighborhood had been steadily increasing for 3 years. But Mrs. Peterson's daughter, living in Minneapolis and dealing with the stress of her mother's declining health, had believed the expert advice. My next stop was the Williams County Assessor's Office, where I requested formal property valuation histories for every address on the LLC's acquisition list. The records told a clear story. Every property had been purchased for significantly less than comparable sales in the same time period. But it was Janet Kowalski who uncovered the smoking gun. Iuteri Tuingoi. She called me that afternoon, her voice tight with excitement. Margaret, I found something. Remember that law firm in Bismarck that's been pressuring the city council about zoning changes? Morrison, Carlisle and Associates? The same Robert Carlisle who showed up at your meeting with threats. I pulled their client list from the State Bar Association. Guess who else they represent? Northern Plains Development? Better than that. They represent the parent company that owns Northern Plains. And Margaret, that parent company has active litigation against the city of Fort Collins over a development project that got shut down after community opposition. The pieces were falling into place. The Hendersons weren't just professional gentrifiers. They were part of a larger operation that used legal intimidation and municipal corruption to override community resistance. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my core group of allies. We gathered at Tom Rodriguez's garage after hours, surrounded by the tools and equipment of honest work, planning our counterattack against predators who had mistaken our community for easy prey. We have enough evidence to request state investigations, I told them. But investigations take time and they might be able to complete their operation before any charges are filed. So what do you want to do? Dorothy asked. I had been thinking about this question for hours. The Hendersons had built their strategy around information asymmetry. They knew things the community didn't, and they used that knowledge to manipulate decisions. But we could turn that weapon against them. We're going to make their business model public, I said. Not just here in Williston, but everywhere they might try to operate next. Tom leaned forward. What do you mean? I mean, we're going to document everything we've learned and make it available to every community organization, every neighborhood association, every local government in North Dakota and beyond. We're going to make sure that Bradley and Cassandra Henderson can never again walk into a community without people knowing exactly who they are and what they do. Mrs. Chen smiled grimly. Make them famous. Exactly. They've been successful because they operate in the shadows. Because each community they target thinks they're dealing with local issues. But once their pattern is exposed, once their methods are documented, they become toxic. Over the next week, we launched what I can only describe as a comprehensive documentation project. Janet coordinated with journalists in Colorado to gather testimony from displaced families. Dorothy organized a social media campaign that shared property records and business registration documents. Tom used his network of working-class families to spread information through schools, churches, and community centers, but the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tiffany Barnes called me on Thursday evening. The woman who had seconded Cassandra's nomination for Neighborhood Association president was crying. Margaret, I need to talk to you. I've made a terrible mistake. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, away from Williston's gossip networks. Tiffany looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by the hollowed-out expression of someone who had learned an uncomfortable truth about themselves. They lied to me, she said without preamble. The Hendersons. They told me this was about community improvement, about bringing professional standards to neighborhood governance. What changed your mind? I got a call from someone claiming to represent Northern Plains Development. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in selling my house. They offered 15% above my mortgage balance, not above market value, above what I still owe. I felt cold understanding wash over me. They knew exactly how much you owed. Down to the dollar. Margaret, the only way they could know that is if they had access to my financial information. And the only person I've discussed my mortgage with recently is Cassandra Henderson. Tiffany reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. I brought you something. Cassandra asked me to make copies of the Neighborhood Association's financial records last month. She said it was for budget planning purposes. But after that phone call, I started wondering what she really wanted them for. The folder contained photocopies of bank statements, expense reports, and vendor contracts going back 5 years. I studied them carefully, looking for patterns. Tiffany, did Cassandra ask you to copy anything else? Property tax records for board members. She said it would help with strategic planning, understanding who might support fee-based improvements and who might need financial assistance. My stomach dropped. The Hendersons hadn't just been manipulating community politics, they had been conducting financial intelligence gathering on their opposition. They knew exactly which families could afford their proposed fees and which ones would be forced to sell. Are you willing to go on record about this? I asked. Tiffany nodded miserably. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why they needed so much detailed information about our neighbor's finances. That evening, I called David again. When I described what Tiffany had revealed, he was quiet for a long moment. Aunt Margaret, what you're describing sounds like wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. This goes way beyond real estate manipulation. What do we do with this information? You call the FBI tonight. The next morning, 2 federal agents sat in my living room, recording detailed statements about everything we had discovered. They were particularly interested in the financial intelligence gathering and the interstate pattern of the operation. Agent Sarah Mitchell, a woman about my daughter's age with sharp eyes and a careful manner, reviewed our documentation with professional thoroughness. Mrs. Coleman, you've assembled a remarkably comprehensive case file. This kind of systematic community displacement scheme is exactly what federal agencies are tasked to investigate. Agent Robert Hughes, her partner, was more direct. These people picked the wrong community to target. And they definitely picked the wrong person to mind her own business. As the agents prepared to leave, Agent Mitchell handed me her card. We'll need a few weeks to develop the investigation, but I want you to know that this case will receive priority attention. Communities have the right to determine their own futures, and no one has the right to manipulate that process for profit. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and realized that something fundamental had shifted. For months, I had been reacting to the Hendersons' initiatives, defending our community against their attacks. But now I was the one setting the agenda. The predators had become the prey, and they didn't even know it yet. The end came faster than any of us expected, but not in the way I had imagined. 3 weeks after the FBI agents left my living room, I was watering plants in my sunroom when I noticed unusual activity at the Henderson house. 2 black SUVs were parked in their driveway, and people in business suits were carrying boxes out of the front door. I called Janet Kowalski immediately. Something's happening at the Hendersons. I'll be right over, she said. 20 minutes later, we stood at my front window watching federal agents systematically remove evidence from 247 Oak Street. Neighbors had begun gathering on sidewalks, speaking in hushed tones about search warrants and financial crimes. But it was what happened next that revealed the true scope of what we had uncovered. Agent Mitchell approached my house around noon, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit who carried herself with the authority of high-level law enforcement. Mrs. Coleman, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Williamson, Agent Mitchell said. She's prosecuting the case we discussed. Williamson shook my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to courtrooms and serious consequences. Mrs. Coleman, your documentation and community organizing have been instrumental in exposing what we believe to be a multi-state financial conspiracy. The evidence you provided led us to investigate similar operations in 7 other states. 7 other states? The Hendersons were part of a much larger network than we initially realized. They've been systematically targeting rural and small-town communities across the Midwest, using identical methods to displace residents and manipulate property markets. Agent Mitchell opened a folder thick with documents. What you exposed here in Williston prevented them from completing their operation and moving on to their next target. According to communications we seized, they had already identified communities in Montana and South Dakota for similar treatment. That afternoon, Janet's story hit the front page of the Williston Herald with a headline that would be picked up by news outlets across the region: FBI breaks up interstate property manipulation scheme. The article detailed not just what had happened in Williston, but the broader pattern of community exploitation that federal investigators had uncovered. The Hendersons weren't just professionals. They were part of an organized criminal enterprise that had displaced hundreds of families across multiple states. But the most satisfying moment came that evening, when I answered my phone to find Cassandra Henderson on the other end. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the desperation underneath. "Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding about our intentions in Williston." "No misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I understand exactly what your intentions were. We were simply trying to implement community improvements. Everything we did was legal." "Wire fraud is legal? Identity theft is legal? Conspiracy to manipulate property values is legal?" There was a long pause. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but—" "I've discovered that you told me to mind my own business," I interrupted. "So I decided to mind yours instead." "Very thoroughly." Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you want?" It was the question I had been waiting for, though I hadn't realized it until she asked. What did I want? Revenge? Apologies? Financial compensation for the stress and disruption they had caused? "I want you gone," I said simply. "I want you to leave our community and never come back. I want every family you tried to displace to keep their homes, and I want to make sure that no other community ever has to deal with people like you again." "The federal investigation will be dropped if we agree to cease operations in North Dakota," she said, confirming what I had suspected. They were trying to negotiate their way out of serious criminal charges. "Mrs. Henderson, you seem to be under the impression that I have some control over federal prosecutors. I don't. What I do have is a complete record of everything you've done here, and I've made sure that record is available to every community organization, every neighborhood association, and every local government official in this region. You're destroying our livelihood." "No," I said. "I'm protecting communities from predators. There's a difference." The call ended without pleasantries. Over the following weeks, the full story continued to unfold. The federal investigation revealed that Northern Plains Development, LLC, was connected to a network of shell companies operating across 8 states. The parent organization had systematically targeted communities with specific characteristics: stable property values, aging populations, and informal governance structures that could be easily manipulated. Bradley Henderson pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. Cassandra Henderson was indicted on multiple federal charges including identity theft, mail fraud, and racketeering. But the legal consequences were only part of the story. The documentation we had assembled, property records, financial manipulation evidence, recorded conversations, and testimony from displaced families, became a case study that was shared with community organizations nationwide. The FBI created a task force specifically focused on identifying and preventing similar schemes before they could destroy communities. Most importantly, our neighborhood survived. The properties owned by Northern Plains Development were sold to a legitimate real estate company with instructions to prioritize sales to local families. The Johnson family finally got their house, Mrs. Brennan's former home, sold to them at exactly the price they had originally negotiated. Mrs. Chen kept her modest house and her garden. Tom Rodriguez continued his auto repair business without interference. The Patel family didn't have to worry about special assessments they couldn't afford. At the neighborhood association meeting 6 months later, we had our highest attendance ever. But this time, people came not because of crisis, but because of community. We discussed normal things: snow removal schedules, the annual block party, fundraising for playground equipment. I was re-elected to the board unanimously, though several newer residents, including Tiffany Barnes, who had become a genuine ally, also volunteered to serve. The difference was that they wanted to contribute to the community we had, not replace it with something else. During the meeting, someone asked if we should implement formal governance structures to prevent future manipulation attempts. I don't think we need complicated rules, I said. We just need to remember that this is our community. When someone tells you to mind your own business, you need to ask yourself whether protecting your neighbors' homes and futures is part of your business. After the meeting, as people were cleaning up and saying their goodbyes, Dorothy Flanagan approached me with a knowing smile. Margaret, I have to ask, did you ever imagine it would end this way when Cassandra first told you to mind your own business? I thought about that morning in the coffee shop, about the months of stress and conflict that followed, about the moment I realized I was fighting, not just for my own place in the community, but for the community's right to exist. No, I said. I thought I was just defending our neighborhood. I didn't realize I was part of something bigger. What do you mean? I mean that communities are more fragile than we think, but also more resilient. The Hendersons thought they could manipulate us because we were just small-town people who didn't understand sophisticated business practices. But they were wrong about what kind of sophistication really matters. 6 months later, I received a letter from a woman in Bozeman, Montana. She had read Janet's articles about our experience and wanted advice about suspicious activities in her own neighborhood. Newcomers pushing expensive improvement plans, property acquisitions by out-of-state LLCs, pressure for governance changes. I spent an hour on the phone with her, sharing everything we had learned about recognizing and responding to predatory development schemes. A week later, she called back to report that her community had successfully prevented a takeover attempt before it could gain momentum. That's when I realized the most important victory wasn't stopping the Hendersons in Williston. It was proving that ordinary people, working together with careful attention to what was really happening around them, could protect their communities from predators who counted on confusion and division to succeed. The Hendersons had told me to mind my own business. By the time I was finished minding theirs, they had lost their business, their freedom, and their ability to harm any other community. Sometimes the best way to protect what you love is to pay very close attention to the people who threaten it. And sometimes, when someone tells you to mind your own business, the most important thing you can do is expand your definition of what that business includes. In the end, our business was taking care of each other, and we had minded that business very well indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.